All right, everybody, let's get started. Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. Welcome into the SCCU Daily Planet Theater. My name is Chris Smith, and I am your host for the Lunchtime Discovery Series. It's great to see you all. Thanks for joining us, whether you're on the first, second, third floors here inside the museum or watching online on the museum's YouTube channel. We're glad you could join us and participate for today's program. Now, the Lunchtime Discovery Series is brought to us by the Office of Environmental Education within the Department of Environmental Quality. They do the fantastic work of coordinating this lecture series, finding and inviting just the best people across North Carolina to come and join us here in the museum or to join us online to deliver exciting presentations. We get to learn so much cool and interesting stuff from really interesting people doing great work out there in North Carolina across science, nature, technology, education, museums, and more. And for today, I feel like we're doing a little bit of the and more today, although it's all related and intersects in so many interesting ways. Of course, the month of March is Women's History Month, so we're very excited that the Office of Environmental Education has put together a fantastic program. We've been hearing from incredible people all month long in this series. Make sure that you go to the museum's YouTube channel. You can go back in the Lunchtime Discovery Series playlist as well and see old programs that we've hosted. They're always there for you, available on demand, so you can do even more exciting learning off of this program. They're a lot of fun, too. I think you'll enjoy them. And, you know, maybe if you have to duck out of this one a few minutes early, you can come back and check it out later, too. Very exciting, a cool thing that we're able to offer here. But I'll remind folks, if you're here in the theater with me, after the presentation, you'll be able to ask questions of our guest speaker. So if you have a thought, put a pin in it. We'll come back to it after the program. And if you're watching online, type your thoughts and questions into the chat on YouTube as we go throughout the program. I'll be able to pull your questions up and share them into our event here inside the Globe after the presentation so that everybody has the opportunity to ask questions, participate, and we can find out more about what you want to know more about. Now, let's get into today's program. I would like everybody to meet our very special guest today. We're very excited, mostly because today's guest was supposed to be here last month, but then we had a kind of a snow day, which is becoming kind of a rare thing in North Carolina these days, it seems. But we're very excited that we're able to rebook, postpone, and then get Chrystal Regan into the stage today. Chrystal Regan is the executive director for Tryon Palace and is going to give us I read the whole history of Tryon Palace in only about 45 minutes. I think she can do it, and I'm very excited to learn more about this place, its history, and the stories, and what they mean to us here in North Carolina. So everybody, please put your hands together and welcome to the stage, Chrystal Regan.
Good afternoon. This side said good afternoon. Thank you, Chris, for that wonderful introduction. And I'm grateful to you all for joining me today. I know some of you are probably wondering what's happening over here, and you have no idea we're going to talk about a history museum. So don't be ashamed if you decide to slide out, but I'd love for you to hang with us. As Chris said, I'm the executive director at Tryon Palace. Fairly new. I've been there less than 2 years, and I'm having an amazing time. I also want to acknowledge my DNCR colleagues who have shown up today to support me. This is an amazing agency trying to do amazing work to educate people on the history of North Carolina and the sciences, but I'm a history person. So a little bit about me before we get started. I'm an educator at heart. I'm a former middle school teacher, former high school teacher, and former high school assistant principal, social studies, history. And then I got pulled into this public history thing and started at the Museum of History as their education section chief before being shipped off to New Bern, to the wild, wild east is what I call it. And I can say that because I'm originally from Eastern North Carolina, from Goldsboro. So this has been a tremendous journey. I'm taking this position at a time when we're focusing on our nation's history, how to interpret it, how to talk about it, how to get people to engage, and to learn from it. So this is a major task, primarily for public historians, but also for educators all over the nation. We are about to celebrate our nation's semi-quincentennial in a year, America 250. And we're going to be having lots of conversations about freedom, democracy, and revolution. And some of it may be intense. It's going to be debates. There are going to be debates, lots of arguments, and I think all of that is healthy because that is the American way. So we hope that you look to Tryon Palace to learn more about the Revolution, colonial America, particularly colonial North Carolina. So thank you for being here. I'm okay with this being a conversational style. If you have a question in the middle of this talk, feel free to raise your hand. Otherwise, we'll talk a little bit more at the close with the last 15 minutes. So thank you again for being here today. If you notice our mantra at Tryon Palace, one history, many voices. And there's a lot to unpack there. We could honestly say there are many histories and many voices. But the goal is to try to pull all of that together to talk about what is a unique experience in the building of our greatest state, which is North Carolina. So this is going to be somewhat of a visual presentation. I'm looking at the same thing on my screen that you're looking at, but I'll have a tendency to turn around just to make sure you're seeing what I'm seeing. But if you notice here, we spent some time talking about how we're going to talk about colonial America during the 60th anniversary of Tryon Palace's grand opening, and of course, building on that with America 250. And so here's a quote from the Royal Governor, William Tryon, which is why we call it Tryon Palace, addressing the members of the Assembly. He said, "I gladly embrace the opportunity here offered to me, making my grateful acknowledgments to the country for the gift of this very elegant and noble structure for the residence of myself and my successors in administration. A palace that is a public ornament," and it still is, even though it was rebuilt many years later, "a credit to the colony, a construction that will remain a lasting monument to this country." Now, it's amazing he said that because I think truer words could not be spoken, but he just didn't know we were going to run him out of his new palace during the Revolution. So I think he has a legacy that he didn't know was coming. So the brief story, and what I'm going to do today is a very high-level overview of the history of the palace and talk a little bit about our programming, because there is no way to talk about the history of thousands of people coming from 3 major continents and how they built a state. There's no way to do that. I would be irresponsible if I tried to cover that history in 45 minutes. So today is going to be an overview, and I hope that you will be interested enough to continue to look to us for programming to learn a little bit more about the people who developed North Carolina. So Governor Tryon, of course, is appointed by the king to oversee the royal colony, and he decides he wants to build a palace. And he had goals to make it a palace, how do I say this? A palace that was unmatched, and the king didn't like that. So he says, well, okay, we want to build a seat of government, but I don't want you to get too big for your britches, to say the least. And that if we build a big palace in the colony of Carolina, then what's going to happen in Georgia and other places? And of course, North Carolina's thinking about what other major colonial site. Who do you think they're competing with? Virginia. More specifically, Williamsburg, right? And of course, we're talking about port cities, so we're thinking about the Charlestons, the Baltimores, eventually New Orleans, and places like that in the Chesapeake area. So this starts out as a proprietary colony, okay? So let's talk a little bit about the geography of the colony. We know we have 3 distinct regions now that we tout in our 8th grade history classes. And we also know that King Charles was granted this huge swath of land. There were 8 proprietors called the Lords Proprietors. So this is an old history lesson for many of you. This was an isolated colony. And we know our coast was quite jagged. We know there's a history of some serious piracy in parts of North Carolina, lots of legal and illegal trade. We know that by the time we get to the 1700s, 3 major continents have converged, all holding many nations. So many European nations, indigenous nations, and we'll talk a little bit about the Tuscarora later, as well as West Africans being brought in directly from West Africa, but primarily from the Caribbean. And so we see this culture mashup, which is unlike anything that you will see in other parts of the world at this time. So we went from 1729 from being a proprietary colony to a royal colony. And by that time, there were a handful of towns that were springing up, and a lot of those towns we could compare to the expansion of Charleston and Williamsburg, where there was a royal governor's residence. But Bath is the oldest town in the colony, and New Bern had been established between 1706 and 1710. There's Beaufort, there's Edenton, there's Brunswick, and then there's Cape Fear, and of course the area that we now call Wilmington that was established. So what did the province or the colony look like? So around this time, we're looking at, and I'm talking mid-1700s, inhabitants between all 3 colonies at this time, about 157,000 people. We have lots of imports and exports, and there's lots of trade. If you compare that to one of the major English colonies, which of course is Jamaica, you can see that in some cases our numbers were higher in terms of inhabitants, but the amount of money that's being made, the imports and the exports, the Caribbean is where it's at. So let's talk very quickly about the major ports, and I've listed them here for you so that you can see where the imports and exports are taking place. I should also note that part of the conversation here is also about indigenous trade. Deerskin trade is major. And a lot of times we don't talk too much about that. We talk about the trade between the colonies and the Caribbean, but deerskins are an important feature of economic trade in the colonial colony. And I'd like to mention, when I mentioned deerskin trade, because of course that is hugely indigenous, we started a community class series at Tryon Palace to help people understand what was happening with indigenous communities prior to the arrival of Europeans. What was Carolina like before Tryon? So if you go to our YouTube page, if that's something that interests you, you can learn a lot about what was happening amongst indigenous nations, the wars between those nations, the trade, and how they had to come to terms with the fact that their world was changing with the onset of European colonization and West African slavery. So despite its exports, North Carolina's economy was always strained by a lack of hard currency. Most of the currency, the money was the trade. Tobacco was currency. Deerskins was currency. Rum was currency. And so how did they maintain an economy that was primarily a mercantilism trade? So it was a two-way street. The products being produced in the colonies flowed to Great Britain or a fellow colony, and the finished goods flowed back to the colonies. And this is why so many of the materials to build Tryon Palace was important. Finished goods, like you would see at IKEA or any place else, was not a common thing. It took a lot to make a product and to pull the materials together to make it happen, which is also why things were so expensive. And that's why the king told William Tryon, you're not going to get that palace. It's just going to cost too much. So we talk about, at this point, erecting a city near the Neuse. And as you all know, New Bern sits on the convergence of the Trent and the Neuse rivers, two very powerful rivers in North Carolina. And so you have a lot of important gentlemen, wealthy gentlemen, politically connected folks who are talking about building a seat of government in New Bern. And so we see this shift from being a proprietary colony, being owned by 8 of the Lord's proprietors, the king's friends and connects, to now being a royal colony. And so William Tryon is at the center of building this palace. The next thing I want to talk about is the fact that we had 2 or 3 royal governors, and many of them had ambitions for making sure that this palace was built and seen to fruition. And Tryon was probably the most aggressive one of those royal governors. He was determined to see that house built. And so now we see the government, or the governor's house, taking shape. As Tryon was trying to get his plans together for the seat of government, he had to hire an architect, John Hawkes. And he brought him with him from England. And what you're looking at now is one of the earliest renderings dating back to 1766. So discussions about the governor's mansion had been in play for many years. And as you can see, it takes a long time to see a structure like this come to place. They signed a contract in January of the following year. I believe it was January 1767. And then Hawkes would be the superintendent of the building and the palace in all aspects, and he was responsible for managing the money that was allotted for the palace, for the labor, and to purchase the materials. Okay? So this is an early rendering or an outline of what the palace would look like. And in a few years' time, all of it would burn to the ground, with the exception of the stables. So when you come to Tryon Palace, if you haven't, and you take that tour, you will be able to see what components are still original to the 1760s timeline. And then a group of amazing ladies will come together many, many, many years later, many generations later, and say, let's rebuild the governor's palace. And for some people, they say, well, why would we want to rebuild a palace that's reminiscent of colonial overrule or colonial oppression? But it was because of that history of him being run out and the very first seat of independent government being set up in New Bern, not Raleigh. And so that is something that these ladies understood, and they wanted future generations to remember what happened during the Revolution and take pride in the fact that New Bern was the original seat of government. So who built the palace? We can talk about the architects, the people with the money, the people with political power, but it's important to know, and this will be another conversation, that many skilled laborers, both white, free African Americans, and enslaved, worked and labored to build that house. And then when the house was rebuilt, the palace, excuse me, I get in trouble if I say house. The palace, when it was rebuilt, you will see another generation of skilled laborers coming in to show people what the original vision was like. Now this is an image from 1955, which harkens back to show just how closely, at least the exterior of the palace, was to the original palace. The part that won't be the same is the furnishings, because when those ladies rebuilt the palace in the 50s, they took trips to Europe and they bought the furniture that Tryon wished he could have had in his palace. And so you get to see a mix of reality and also a revisionist history in a very entertaining and creative way when you walk through the palace. And our amazing interpreters will show you what is original, what was rebuilt to the original specs, and what was added by the women who rebuilt the palace. The palace was quite remarkable for its time. It was not popular amongst the average person. And why do you think that is? The cost. The average person, of course, could not build their own palace. And this also dealt with an increase in pricing, right? Concerns about taxation, concerns about who would pay for this remarkable palace. And so we can sit back and look and say, oh, isn't this beautiful? But in the middle of it, the average working person has some concerns. And you can argue that this sort of extravagance was also some of the fuel to the fire of the revolution. Okay. So, concerning the palace, I also wanted to show you, let's see, let me go back here. the main street. And I've got some other images of New Bern and what it looked like, because that stable area was still there, no house. Many people had no idea that that palace was there because it had been gone for so long. And so this is just one of the main streets that many of the architects looked at in order to think about how they wanted to build the palace. Okay. There's a very important historical book written about Governor Tryon and the North Carolina Royal Governors by Alonzo Dill. And he says in it, it is almost as if Tryon's palace lived and breathed, at last grew old and died, and became a name in the history book and tradition encrusted with romance. And many of us who work in public history understand the importance of pulling together what is original and what is envisioned. And the hard part is properly interpreting that, because we do have a tendency sometimes to romanticize the past. And part of romanticizing the past, romanticizing the past is part of our history. So if we don't talk about those ladies and their vision and those extravagant furnishings, then that is a sense of erasure as well. So we want to make sure we're telling the story all the way through. The next thing, let's see here, is to look at a very quick timeline of the early interest and efforts of rebuilding Tryon Palace after it burned down. This vision wasn't brought to fruition until the 1950s, I want to say 1955, but as you can see, people were thinking about it in the late 1890s. So anytime you think your goal isn't being achieved quick enough, just remember that for some folks, they never see it. But they put together the foundational work and the groundwork to see it happen. Interest in rebuilding Tryon's Palace was as early as the late 1890s, became a really important fixation for the Daughters of the Revolution in the 1920s. And then we start seeing pageantry and efforts to bring the palace to the forefront in the late 1920s. Let's see here. And then we see the architects again. And this time, these are the architects who are going to work to rebuild the palace as close to the original guidelines as possible. So we see here William Perry of Perry and Shaw, and this is an architectural firm outside of Boston. But many of them had done work internationally, and they were sought after, chased after by the wealthiest folks to rebuild and to reconstruct many of our colonial sort of structures from the past. They worked with Colonial Williamsburg and some other coastal towns who were working to rebuild their important historical structures. Okay? And let's talk about the benefactors. The lady you see here is Maud Moore Latham. Bequest. From 1941 to 1944, there was a little bit of traction. They were still living off the memories of their grandmothers at this point. But this lady, who was considered one of the dreamers, there were about 5 women who we call the dreamers, who worked together and put pressure on their politically astute and very wealthy husbands to spend money to rebuild the palace. She was born in New Bern and had grown up listening to stories of her father talk about the city's history, and she was especially fascinated by the palace. So she began to work with 4 of the ladies, including Ruth Cannon and others, on the old homes surrounding where the palace was, and also looking at how to build gardens so that they could generate revenue to continue with this legacy. So then we see the major years of reconstruction of the palace in 1953 through 1959. There was a lot of interest, again, in restoring the palace. These ladies worked really hard for the marketing efforts of it. US 70 had been extended over where the palace grounds were, and then George Street, which is right across from the palace, featured lots of homes and shops. And so the question is, how do they work around that to see this building take place? They began to go to archives and pull together some of the original drawings. And in this image, you can see there's an aerial photograph right around the 200 block of George Street, all around it. And all the homes around that had been dismantled or moved or blocked in order to rebuild the palace. Very controversial stuff, okay? So in succeeding in getting a highway moved and an entire block of homes, these were some pretty powerful people. And they felt strongly about rebuilding and re-envisioning the palace. So as you can imagine, there were lots of upset residents at that time. But they carried on, they moved on, and then ultimately there was a grand opening in April of 1959 with the state governor and legislators convening in what was the former palace chamber. And people still hold events and meetings in that space. It seems like a sacred space politically to this day. So then we move on to expanding the site. So over the years, we found out that there were many, I say we as if I were living in 1953, but the people who were affiliated, the commissioners associated with Tryon Palace, began to buy up historical properties that have amazing significance as well. And what you see here is the John Wright Stanley House. I could do an entire program on John Wright Stanley, but that home is still there. We are continuously working on it. A lot of these older homes are very expensive to keep up, and there's a lot of work that goes into making sure you handle the bats, rats, mold, and asbestos, and that you are protecting the furniture and the paintings that are in these homes. But these are worthy projects. They represent the earliest parts of North Carolina history. So very quickly here, I want to talk about the structures that we steward. There's an annex at McCarthy Square. We have a commission house where we still use it and have meetings. The Cook House, which is where our United States Colored Troops, the 35th, the reenactors, meet and plan. The Dave's House, Disasway. The Hay House at this point is still a standing structure, but needs a lot of work. The Jones House is where our educators have their offices. The Dixon House, we have a kitchen office, a New Bern Academy, which is also a museum, and the North Carolina History Center, which houses many of our important artifacts and displays. And then, of course, you just saw a picture of the Stanley House and the way station. Tryon Palace is not just a historic site. We also have a history center with museums. We manage many historical homes. And in case you didn't know, the collections holds about 10,000 important objects related to North Carolina's history, from fine art to furniture, from the 17th through the present day. We have a conservation lab where we take care of these artifacts in our collection, and we send some of them out for expert care. So come see us. I want to conclude because I want to take some time for questions and for discussion to talk a little bit about Tryon Palace's efforts to be competitive, continue to be competitive in terms of reaching young people. We focus on a lot of school groups. They come and visit us, particularly 8th graders and some 4th graders. We want to focus on high school students and lots of our retirees. So any given day, you're going to see somebody walking really slow or running really fast when they come and visit Tryon Palace and take a tour. And they are our most precious visitors, our most precious clients, if you will, who come and keep this space alive. Tryon Palace is a private-public partnership, which means, yes, we're run by the state of North Carolina, but we depend on the goodwill of citizens and other people who visit to contribute so that we can keep this for posterity. So with that, we do lots of programs. So we keep up with our interpretive measures, and we're doing more programs on the History Center side, which means you have to come visit us and come to our programs as well. With those interpretive measures, we have launched a new tour that has been updated We probably had not updated that tour in 10 to 15 years. And so now we have a new interpretive tour that pulls in some of the important global aspects of what was happening in Eastern North Carolina and across the globe. And so while we're focusing on local history, it's important to remember that the people who built the city, the people who were in charge, the people who had political power were able to maneuver and to get things done on a global scale. So you can't just talk about where you are, you have to talk about how where you are fits on a global scale. And that was what the royal governors were able to do. Part of our programming is made up of a community class series that we're developing, an In Conversation series where we're bringing in people who have made major contributions to Eastern North Carolina to come and speak to our audiences and to answer their questions and talk about why that part of the state is still very relevant and rich in history and in its economy. And we are working on a series called Colonial Cocktails. So you might need a designated driver if you come and see us with Colonial Cocktails. The goal is to have fun and to entertain people, but at the same time educate them. So once you have that cocktail in your hand, you have to think about what did it take to put that cocktail together. Whether it's citrus, whether it's bitters, whether it's rum, what does it take for you to enjoy that beverage? Now hopefully after you hear about what it takes, it won't sober you up. But it's important to note just how extravagant our global trade and commerce was. So we're thinking about creative ways to engage the public, help people see what we're doing at Tryon Palace, and make sure that this will be an important stop as we celebrate our nation's birthday. With that, thank you. Thank you for your time. And we've got about 20 minutes for a conversation and for questions. I'd be remiss if I did not mention Lindy Cummings, who is our research historian and educator extraordinaire, who keeps all of this history in the back of her head. And how she does it, I don't know. But I want to thank her publicly for all the hard work that she has done and for the amazing way in which she puts together these histories. We've got lots of images we could have shown, but I tried to put just a few of them together to whet your palate today. So with that, are there any questions or comments?
Well, thank you very much. Excellent stuff. If you're down here on the first floor and you've got a question you'd like to ask, just wave at me. I'll bring you a microphone. Ed, you're doing a great job. I'll bring you a microphone. That way everybody in the room can hear wherever you're at. If you're up on the balconies and you've got questions, just step up to the glass wall and then wave down at me. We'll glance up there every now and then. And you'll have to yell at us, but we'll repeat the questions into the microphone to make sure everybody can hear. So I think the first question is back here in the back row.
Thank you for the presentation. So if we go there, you have guided tours?
Yes. We have guided tours for the palace, ticketed guided tours for the palace, and ticketed self-guided tours in the History Center, which is about a block over from the palace. So our History Center, I think I mentioned, was built around 2010, 2011, to house these exhibits that we wouldn't have space to show our collections without. And that was a huge effort on the part of state government and many, many, many generous donors to build that History Center. That is where our auditorium is, where we will have those programs that I mentioned. But then the tour is separate on the other side with the palace.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Blair. Nice to meet you, by the way. Born and raised in North Carolina, right? Never knew that Tryon Place was the original place of govern. What made them decide to go to Raleigh?
That's an excellent question. And part of it is a very similar story. This is a simple answer. Remember that our national capital was where before it was in Washington, D.C.? Philadelphia, right? So if you think about it from a geographical standpoint, it was about centering government. and people not feeling like one region was more powerful than the other. We know that many people in the western part of the state felt like coming all the way to New Bern was a problem. And so Raleigh was the center, if you will, for North Carolina state government. And there are many other arguments, historical arguments about why it went to Raleigh, but that is one of the major things that we tend to talk about in terms of why it shifted from New Bern to Raleigh.
Thank you.
I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the circumstances of Tryon leaving North Carolina, why he left. I know he went to New York, but I just wondered what made him do that.
Oh, he was running for his life. That's the short answer. And we plan to talk about that in detail in 2026. Those 10 years leading up to the revolution, people had invested a lot but got really nervous about the unrest and the unsettlement, particularly in the colonies. But I will say this, and I don't want to mess up anybody's dream, but North Carolina and particularly South Carolina were loyalist strongholds for a very long time. We love to tout that we're patriots and that our great-great-grandparents were right there fighting the redcoats. But for a long time, the southern colonies remained a stronghold. And so his departure was more abrupt, I would say, than some of the other royal governors. But we're planning on having a program specifically to talk about him and his departure and the eve of the revolution, which is full of lots of amazing facts and details about his departure.
Will you have a costumed reenactor just take off out the front door down the path as fast as they can run?
We could very well, Chris. I've got some creative folks on my team, and we got to reel them back in sometime. But that is what people love. That's what the visitors love. We also have something called Candlelight that happens every year in December, a family event where we do a special interpretive tour, a candlelit tour, in our palace. Fife and drum plays. There's an encampment, lots of food and entertainment. Come see us. You get a chance to see people in costume reenacting some of our more prominent ancestors, if you will, for some of us. In that space.
First of all, thank you for a great presentation. One of the interesting things I always found about the restoration was that it took place during World War II, in a time where it was pretty common to try to resurrect a certain unique colonial past. Did World War II or any of these societies during the early 1940s, did that bolster restoration efforts? What was the interaction of World War II with, maybe not even Tryon Palace, but are there other examples of societies really grasping on to those restoration efforts during that time? Because this was finished 1959, I believe that said. So did World War II play a unique role in that aspect?
That's an excellent question. That's a great question. And I would imagine, and I don't want to misspeak, this may be a good question for our research historian, but patriotism and a resurgence of a powerful aspect of our past is always a motivator for these sort of preservation projects. And at the same time, we have this conversation about our monuments, right? Our Civil War monuments and what causes people to want to resurrect these sorts of things, good, bad, and ugly. But when you think about World War II and the Greatest Generation, right? That, of course, I'm sure was a motivator. And I'm sure we can go back. There are written correspondence between these ladies, the dreamers, where they talk about what their motivations were. And again, these were ups and downs. This was something that had been in the works for generations, as early as the 1890s. And we see some of this slow down because of the Great Depression, because it may not be popular to spend a lot of money on certain things when the nation is suffering. So I think that by the time the 50s rolled around, which is a very prosperous time for many Americans, that is when they could get a real foothold to put together all the work, because nothing happens overnight, right? To put that work together to see the palace completed.
Great stuff. Let me grab some from the chat on YouTube for you. Michael wants to know if the Governor's Palace in Colonial Williamsburg had any influence on the design of Tryon Palace.
We talked a little bit about some of that competitive edge about rebuilding it. So the short answer is yes. And right now, we're planning to have some conversations with Colonial Williamsburg. We want to exchange some information, look at their archive just to see if there's that sort of correspondence. Lindy may know as our research historian, but yes, many of the older homes that were being preserved throughout the colonial South, there was a sense of spirited competition to see how quickly we could restore many of these palaces. Well, now there's only 2 palaces in the South, but the palace and the other historic homes.
I guess ours doesn't have a theme park yet, so we're not. Maybe that's okay.
No theme park yet. No theme park yet.
David wants to know how many different events are happening at Tryon Palace these days.
Ooh, Candlelight is our biggest event. We also have a series of fundraisers that we are working on. Some of them have been in place for many, many years. We do a big oyster roast, steamed oysters, and it's called Winter Feast. We make lots of money with that. People come and visit. So that is an event I'd love for you to come. Go ahead and prepare for that next year. Candlelight is especially important. And the programs that I mentioned to you, the community class program, In Conversation, and the upcoming Colonial Cocktails are all brand new programs and events to Tryon Palace.
That's an impressive lineup. Really is.
And I'm sure I'm missing something, and I'll get chewed out when I get back. So make sure you go to our website because I'm not mentioning everything.
Thank you for the presentation. I think I see daffodils, tulips, and maybe lupine flowers in the garden. Were those indicative of the original flowers that might have been in the gardens?
Many of the flowers that you'll see were not there at the time. Many of our gardens are fairly recent. As I mentioned, Governor Tryon was not able to have the vision that he wanted to have. And so many of our gardens have developed over the past 60 to 70 years with the beginning of the rebuilding of the palace. And when we do have tours, we have garden lectures and garden tours that explain which of these plants were native, which ones would have been vibrant at the time, and which ones have been recently introduced. And so a lot of times when people visit, even the plants and flowers that are in the palace, many of them would not have been there in the 1790s or even the 1950s. So there's a constant shift in terms of the flowers and the green spaces that we try to cultivate, which is part of an environmental discussion that we want to continue to have as we talk about what's changing in Eastern North Carolina, partly because of climate.
All about that.
You mentioned school students being a huge percentage of the visitors that you get. And I think this is a question that those of us who do non-formal education and public history work grapple with all the time. How is Tryon Palace helping students find themselves, find their stories, find their experiences in a place that looks very different from the experience that they're living right now?
That's a great question. One of the things that we're working on, in addition to our programming, with community class, we are recording all those programs so that teachers who want to share those programs with their students can do so. We're now working to make sure there's a curricular tie that we could put in. We're going to do the fun stuff and then make it fit with the curriculum, because we know that that sort of virtual learning is so important. We are now working to restructure parts of our education section to do a little bit more outreach to make sure we're hitting those marks with teachers, because many of them who bring their school groups have to justify and show why that visit is so important. And so we're working hard to make sure we make those connections. In terms of students seeing themselves, that is part of the reason to constantly update an interpretive tour. So for example, we know that there were enslaved people who lived and worked and free around Tryon Palace. For many, many years, and this happens in a lot of historic sites, that was sort of, we're just going to talk about the beautiful picture on the wall, and we're going to talk about the most powerful and the most wealthy. And so it's not a trivial thing. We're talking about these people because they were there, they existed, and we want to talk about how they interacted with each other. And I think no matter where a kid comes from, their socioeconomic status, race, or gender, telling the whole story helps young people to actually see themselves. And we're trying to uncover more about those stories. Just this past year, we put a beautiful plaque up in one of our gardens and named it the Garden of Remembrance, where we do have the names, the known names, of enslaved people who worked in and around the palace. And that is sort of a sacred meditative space to help people remember and know who was also a part of this story.
Wonderful stuff. All right, a few more minutes. I got another one from the chat for you.
Okay.
Kenneth wants to know if Governor Tryon and the royal family had a good working relationship.
With
I guess King George didn't want to give Tryon his palace, but were they okay otherwise?
That's an excellent question. I don't know much about that. Our research historian could talk to, was that Kenneth?
Yep.
So Kenneth, don't hesitate to email Lindy Cummings. She loves questions like that, and it helps us to do better with some of our presentations. There's no way, with me being primarily an administrator, I keep all of that. But I will tell you that I do spend time reading William Tryon's correspondence, where he writes letters, keeps sort of notes about what is happening, and sometimes you can read between the lines. He would never put in his correspondence that he has an issue with the king.
Makes sense.
But sometimes things are inferred. And there are other more private correspondences that may speak to that relationship. So I think that's an excellent question.
That's like, I don't put things about the director of the museum in my work emails either. She's right there, buddy. It's okay. It's safe.
Yeah. That's why I didn't.
Smiled when I said that. We're okay. Chrystal, I'm curious, if I'm going to come, I've not been to Tryon Palace, but I need to come. It's a DNCR site, just like the Museum of Natural Sciences. I've been trying to get around to them. But what's a corner of Tryon Palace or a corner of the grounds that I should go to where you're like, don't miss that part? Or maybe something that people tend to walk past or not look at, even if it's included on the tours, but that you would say, you know what, don't miss this thing. This thing means a lot.
And the answer to that is going to vary from person to person. And I would give you a different answer next week. But thinking about this right now and walking through the tour again, the kitchen.
Mm-hmm.
And I say that because that is the area where you find your servants and you see what it's like to have a menial job, if you will. To see how I don't want to say how the other half lives, because I know that's a very important work, but to see history from below, I think is a really important thing to do. We've just got our front gates refurbished, so they're beautiful now, steel gates with gold accents. Many people like to see the stable house because that is an original piece. Some people struggle with looking at something that has been recreated. But when they see something that was actually there 300 years ago, it speaks to them, no matter how in ornament that it might be. So I think I would ask people when they visit to pay attention to those little areas and not just sort of the glamorous part of the palace.
I'll make sure to do that. And I guess maybe I'm going to look, maybe the last one for today. Can you share a little bit with us about what Tryon Palace is doing to get ready for America 250? Right, it's going to be a big deal, and we're hearing a lot about it at DNCR sites all across the state. We're all getting ready for it in lots of different ways. Even here at the Science Museum, we're thinking about it. But your site, I feel like, is a particular standard bearer for this event.
It is, and there's a little bit of pressure
Not
all
to put
eyes,
any
a
on
little
you.
pressure. And Christy, I'll pick on her because she is Director of Education, and we're working closely with DNCR to make sure that everyone knows about what we're planning. And so I'll start out with talking about some of our programming that I've already mentioned, the new interpretive tour. We'll be working closely with our fife and drum, which you all will see perform whenever you come to Candlelight. We are also talking about working with school groups and educators and working closely with our other partners across the state to highlight what was actually happening at the height of the revolution. So many of our programs are still in the planning process, so you'll have to check our website to see what we're planning for 2026. We also host and partner with the Sons of the Revolution. So we'll be planning lots of events with that particular group that is located there in New Bern, as well as the Daughters of the Revolution, to make sure that it's a total experience, that it is a local history experience, and not just a Tryon Palace experience. So we're telling everyone to come to New Bern.
Chrystal, thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you all for having me, for being so kind, and for your wonderful questions.
Fantastic program. This was amazing. Thanks so much. And well, I love that here in the Natural Sciences Museum too, we're ending on the gardens and not just like the inside of the house. I don't know, we're a nature museum, so there's some nature for you. We did it. But Chrystal, thank you for being here. Fantastic presentation. I'm excited to get out there. Yeah, please do.
I should have mentioned in terms of programming, we're hoping, we've submitted an application, a reapplication to Z. Smith Reynolds, which many of you are familiar with their philanthropic work on an inclusive public art project. And this goes back, Sonia, to your question about people seeing themselves. We're using this work, Catherine, I want to say Beischer, that I'm saying that correctly, who has written extensively about African-American artisans, craftsmen, and women who helped to build New Bern. And we're hoping that in conjunction with the Tryon Palace Foundation, Tryon Palace Commission, and with Z. Smith Reynolds, we'll see this project to fruition, where there'll be an amazing piece of art on one of our properties called Wilson Park in the middle of downtown New Bern. And there'll be lots of exciting programming that will go along with that. So if you're interested in that type of history, which is a New Bern history, about craftsmen, women, and artisans, check out Crafting Lives.
Yeah, very glad you threw that in. That's exciting. That's cool stuff. Right. Well, let's see. Y'all have got Google. You can find Tryon Palace. It's out in New Bern. Don't miss it. And, you know, while you're checking out that DNCR site, there is lots more across the state of North Carolina that you can see and do. But you know what? You're here in the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. So right now I'm going to say thanks for coming and visiting us today, for being a part of the programming that we host here at the museum. Thanks to the museum's digital media team. And of course, thanks again to the Office of Environmental Education over in the Department of Environmental Quality for organizing and bringing this program to the museum almost every Wednesday. And I say almost because next Wednesday at noon, we're not going to have a Lunchtime Discovery Series lecture, but we will be back here again inside the globe for another program in 2 more weeks. We'll be talking about the recovery after Helene in Western North Carolina with Mountain Resources Conservation's Program Director, Mariah. So don't miss out. We'll be back here in 2 weeks for another program. And until then, naturalsciences.org for all of your natural science museum needs. You can also check out the Office of Environmental Education online at northcarolinaee.org. Thanks for coming out, everybody. We'll see you again soon. Bye.